After 4 months of staring at spreadsheets and fluorescent office lights, I finally cracked. The camping trip had been rolling around in my head for weeks, and when I pitched it to Eric and Stephanie over drinks last Friday, they jumped on it immediately. We'd all been feeling the same restless energy that comes from too much indoor time and not enough real adventure. I'd been researching potential spots for the better part of March, scrolling through hiking forums and studying trail maps during my lunch breaks. Eric had mentioned hearing about this remote section of the Olympic National Forest from some guys he'd met at a gear shop, though he'd never been there himself. The area sounded perfect. Far enough off the beaten path to avoid crowds, but not so remote that we'd need technical climbing gear or wilderness survival training. Loading the truck took longer than expected. I'd spread all our gear across my apartment floor the night before, making sure we had everything on my carefully crafted checklist. 3 sleeping bags, backpacking tent, camp stove, water purification tablets, first aid kit, headlamps, the works. Stephanie showed up at 8 sharp with 2 enormous duffel bags stuffed with enough food to feed a small army. "You realize we're only going for 4 days, right?" I asked, hefting one of the bags into the truck bed. "Better to have too much than not enough," she said, already moving to help Eric load his pack. "Besides, I got those freeze-dried meals that are supposed to actually taste decent." Eric spread his topographic maps across my kitchen table while I finished organizing the gear. He'd been studying the trail routes for days, marking potential water sources and noting elevation changes with the kind of focus most people reserved for work presentations. The guy knew the Pacific Northwest backcountry better than anyone I'd met, but even he admitted this particular area was uncharted territory for him. "According to this, the main trail splits about 3 miles in," he said, tracing a route with his finger. "We want the northern fork. Takes us up through some old growth forest, then down into a valley where there's supposed to be a good clearing near a creek." The drive started easy enough, cruising north on I-5 through Seattle's suburbs before cutting west toward the Olympic Peninsula. Traffic thinned out once we hit the smaller highways, and the landscape began shifting from strip malls and subdivisions to actual wilderness. Towering Douglas firs lined both sides of the road, their trunks so massive that 3 people holding hands couldn't wrap around them. Eric rode shotgun, occasionally pointing out landmarks he recognized from previous trips. He had this way of turning every camping expedition into a story, weaving together details about weather conditions, wildlife encounters, and the personalities of whoever had been with him. Most of his tales involved some combination of unexpected challenges and last-minute problem-solving, usually delivered with enough humor to make you want to experience the adventure yourself. "See that ridge up there?" he said, gesturing toward a distant mountain peak. "That's where Jake and I got completely turned around 2 summers ago. Spent 6 hours hiking in circles because he insisted his compass was broken." Stephanie had claimed the back seat, organizing and reorganizing the food supplies with the same methodical approach she brought to everything. She'd volunteered to handle meal planning for the entire trip, creating a detailed menu that accounted for nutritional needs, pack weight, and cooking time. The woman could probably coordinate a military supply chain if she put her mind to it. The roads grew progressively narrower and more winding as we climbed into the mountains. What had started as smooth asphalt became rougher pavement, then eventually gave way to gravel and dirt. My truck handled the terrain fine, but I found myself slowing down to navigate around potholes that looked deep enough to swallow a tire. "This is why I bought the 4-wheel drive," I said, steering around a particularly nasty crater in the road. "Good call," Eric replied, studying the landscape. "Some of these access roads can get pretty sketchy, especially after heavy rain." We stopped at the ranger station about an hour before reaching the trailhead. The building looked like something from the 1970s, all wood paneling and faded government posters about fire safety and leave no trace principles. An elderly ranger with a weathered face and thick gray beard processed our backcountry permit, asking standard questions about our experience level and planned route. "You folks planning to camp in the valley?" he asked, marking our permit with an official stamp. "That's the idea," I said. "Near the creek, if we can find a good spot." He nodded slowly, then made a note on his clipboard. "Been some bear activity in that area recently. Nothing too concerning, but make sure you hang your food properly. Got bear canisters?" We confirmed that we did, and he went through the usual warnings about proper food storage and waste disposal. As we prepared to leave, he mentioned that we were the first group he'd registered for that particular trail in over a week. "Not many people know about it," he said. "Most folks stick to the more popular trails closer to the visitor center." The final stretch of road proved to be the worst yet. What the map optimistically labeled as a Forest Service road was really just 2 tire tracks, separated by a strip of grass and weeds. Branches scraped against both sides of the truck as I picked my way carefully around fallen logs and washouts. At one point, I had to get out and move a decent-sized branch that was blocking our path entirely. "Definitely earning our wilderness experience points on this one," Stephanie said, bracing herself against the door as we bounced through another series of ruts. The trailhead parking area, when we finally reached it, consisted of nothing more than a small, cleared space with room for maybe 6 vehicles. A weathered wooden sign marked the beginning of the trail, along with the standard Forest Service warnings about permits and regulations. Only 2 other cars were parked there, a dusty sedan that looked like it had been there for days, and a newer SUV with mountain bike racks on the roof. "Guess we picked a good spot for avoiding crowds," Eric said, shouldering his pack and adjusting the straps. I checked my watch as we gathered our gear. Nearly 4 o'clock, which meant we'd have maybe 3 hours of good daylight left for hiking. The 5-mile trail to our planned campsite should be manageable in that time, assuming we didn't run into any major obstacles along the way. The packs felt heavier than they had in my apartment, but that always happened at the beginning of a trip. My body would adjust to the weight within the first mile or 2, and then the rhythm of hiking would take over. There's something about shouldering a pack and heading into the wilderness that immediately shifts your mindset from the everyday concerns of city life to more fundamental priorities, where you'll sleep, what you'll eat, how far you can walk before dark. Eric took point, consulting his map and compass to make sure we started on the right trail. The path began wide and well-maintained, clearly marked with occasional blazes on the trees. Within a few hundred yards, though, it narrowed considerably and began climbing steadily upward through dense forest. The first thing I noticed was how quiet everything seemed. No traffic noise, no sirens, no urban background hum that you don't realize you're hearing until it disappears. Just the sound of our boots on the trail, the occasional bird call, and the whisper of wind through the massive trees surrounding us. "This is what I've been missing," I said, breathing deeply and feeling my shoulders relax for the first time in months. The Douglas firs here were incredible, easily the largest trees I'd ever hiked among, their trunks rising straight up for what seemed like hundreds of feet before disappearing into the canopy above. Shafts of late afternoon sunlight filtered down through the branches, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere that made you want to walk quietly and speak in hushed tones. After 20 minutes of steady climbing, we reached the trail junction Eric had marked on his map. A smaller wooden sign pointed north toward Valley Creek Trail, while the main path continued west toward more popular destinations. We took the northern fork, entering what felt like even wilder territory. The trail here was less maintained, requiring us to step over fallen logs and navigate around overgrown sections where the vegetation had begun reclaiming the path. Eric moved confidently ahead, occasionally pausing to check his map and make sure we were still on course. Stephanie kept pace easily, her organizational skills apparently extending to efficient hiking techniques. I brought up the rear, partly to keep an eye on our group and partly because I wanted to fully absorb the experience. This was exactly what I'd been craving during all those hours trapped in the office. The physical challenge of moving through wild country with everything you needed carried on your back. The mental clarity that comes from focusing on immediate, tangible goals, and the deep satisfaction of being completely self-sufficient in a beautiful remote place. The mountains rose dramatically on all sides, their peaks still topped with snow despite the warm spring weather down in the valleys. Streams crossed the trail in several places, requiring careful navigation across slippery rocks or fallen logs that served as makeshift bridges. Each crossing brought the sound of rushing water and the cool, mineral scent of snowmelt from high elevations. "Water sources look good," Eric called back, consulting his notes. "Should be plenty where we're headed." As we hiked deeper into the forest, I found myself noticing details that would have been invisible from a car or during a casual day hike. The way different tree species clustered in specific microclimates, how the undergrowth changed depending on the amount of sunlight reaching the forest floor, the intricate patterns of moss and lichen covering rocks and fallen logs. This was the kind of awareness that only came from slowing down and paying attention, something that modern life rarely allowed time for. The trail continued climbing steadily, winding through switchbacks that offered occasional glimpses of the valley below. Each turn revealed new perspectives on the surrounding peaks and ridges, creating a constantly changing panorama of wilderness that stretched to the horizon in every direction. My legs had found their rhythm now, the initial heaviness of the pack settling into something more manageable. Stephanie was hiking strong, occasionally commenting on interesting plants or rock formations she noticed along the way. Eric maintained his steady pace at the front, periodically checking our progress against his planned timeline. About halfway there, he announced during a brief water break, making good time. The afternoon light was beginning to shift toward evening, casting longer shadows and giving the forest a golden, magical quality. Somewhere ahead lay our planned campsite, a clearing near the creek where we'd spend the next 3 nights. The thought of setting up camp, cooking dinner over our portable stove, and sleeping under the stars filled me with anticipation. This was exactly what I'd needed. Real adventure, physical challenge, and the chance to reconnect with wild places that existed completely independent of human schedules and concerns. After shouldering our heavy packs, we began the 5-mile hike to our planned campsite, with me feeling energized by the fresh mountain air and spectacular scenery surrounding us. The trail proved more challenging than Eric's map had suggested. What looked like straightforward switchbacks on paper turned into a maze of fallen logs and overgrown vegetation that forced us to stop and bushwhack around obstacles every few hundred yards. Eric's optimism from his initial route assessment began wearing thin as we encountered our 3rd stream crossing in less than half a mile. The first creek had been simple enough, a few well-placed rocks that served as stepping stones across clear, cold water. By the time we reached the second crossing, though, the makeshift log bridge looked questionable at best. Eric tested it carefully with his hiking pole before committing his full weight, feeling the wood flex ominously under his boots. "Watch yourselves here," he called back to Stephanie and me. "This thing feels like it could give way any second." The 3rd stream proved the most problematic. No convenient logs or rock formations offered an obvious path across, leaving us to pick our way through knee-deep water that soaked through our supposedly waterproof hiking boots. The current was stronger than it looked, and more than once I had to grab onto overhanging branches to keep my balance while navigating the slippery rocks beneath the surface. Each crossing ate up precious daylight and energy. What should have been a pleasant afternoon hike was turning into a slow, methodical process of problem-solving and careful navigation. Eric consulted his map frequently, frowning as he tried to reconcile what we were experiencing with what the trail descriptions had promised. "These aren't even marked on here," he said, pointing to his topographic map during a brief rest. "Either this is really old information, or we're dealing with seasonal changes that weren't accounted for." The vegetation grew thicker as we climbed higher into the valley. Massive Douglas firs gave way to an understory so dense it blocked out most of the remaining afternoon light. Devil's club and salmonberry bushes crowded the trail, forcing us to push through branches that grabbed at our packs and scratched exposed skin. Eric found himself using his trekking poles like machetes, beating back the worst of the overgrowth, so Stephanie and I could pass through without getting completely tangled up. What struck me most was how quiet everything had become. During the first part of our hike, I'd noticed the usual forest sounds: birds calling from the canopy, the scurry of small animals moving through the underbrush, the buzz of insects around our heads. Now, though, the woods seemed almost unnaturally silent. No chirping, no rustling, no background hum of life that you'd expect in a healthy forest ecosystem. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is up here?" I asked during one of our breaks. Eric paused his map consultation and tilted his head, listening. "Yeah, actually, that's weird. Usually you get more bird activity near water sources." Stephanie nodded, adjusting her pack straps. "I was thinking the same thing. It's like everything just stopped making noise." We pressed on through the increasingly difficult terrain, each of us lost in our own thoughts about the strange absence of wildlife. In all my camping experiences, I'd never encountered a forest that felt so empty of life. Even in the depths of winter, you'd expect to hear something: the call of a jay, the rustle of a squirrel, the distant drumming of a woodpecker. The trail finally began descending toward our planned campsite, just as the last rays of sunlight started filtering through the canopy at sharper angles. My legs ached from the constant up and down navigation, and my shoulders burned from the weight of my pack. All three of us were moving more slowly now, fatigue setting in after what had turned into a much longer and more demanding hike than anticipated. I checked my watch as we rounded a bend and caught sight of open space ahead. Nearly 7:30. We'd been hiking for over 3 hours, significantly longer than Eric had originally estimated. The combination of difficult stream crossings, overgrown trails, and careful navigation through dense vegetation had slowed our progress to barely more than a mile per hour. The clearing opened up before us like a welcome oasis after hours of fighting through thick forest, maybe 50 yards across, with relatively flat ground and a clear creek running along one edge. The spot looked perfect for our needs: level tent sites, fresh water, and enough open sky to actually see stars once full darkness fell. Eric dropped his pack with obvious relief and started surveying potential tent locations. "This'll work great. Good drainage, protected from wind, close to water." I claimed a spot near the center of the clearing for our kitchen area, spreading out my sleeping pad to test the ground for rocks and roots. The earth felt soft and level, covered with a thin layer of pine needles that would provide natural cushioning. Stephanie headed toward the tree line, gathering dead branches and fallen wood for our camp needs. The division of labor happened automatically, each of us falling into our established roles from previous camping trips. Eric handled shelter setup with his usual methodical approach, testing guy line tension and checking stake placements twice. I organized our cooking gear and water purification supplies, setting up the camp stove on a flat boulder that would serve as our kitchen counter. Stephanie returned with an armload of dry wood, stacking it carefully near our designated fire ring. "Found plenty of fuel," she said, wiping sweat from her forehead. "Though I have to say, it's still eerily quiet over there." She was right. As darkness began settling over the forest, I'd expected the usual evening chorus of wildlife: owls beginning their nightly hunts, insects emerging for nighttime activity, the rustle of nocturnal animals starting their daily routines. Instead, the silence seemed to deepen with each passing minute. Even the creek, which should have provided a constant background murmur of flowing water, seemed unusually muted. I walked over to the bank and looked down at the stream, watching clear water flow over smooth stones without making much noise at all. It was as if someone had turned down the volume on the entire forest. The feeling hit me gradually at first, then with increasing intensity, the sensation that we weren't alone in this clearing. Not in a friendly, welcoming way, but with the uncomfortable awareness that comes from being observed by unseen eyes. I found myself glancing toward the dark tree line more frequently, scanning for movement or shapes that didn't belong. "You guys feeling okay about this spot?" I asked, trying to sound casual while zipping up my tense rainfly. Eric looked up from securing his guy lines. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. Just seems different than I expected." Stephanie straightened from organizing her gear, studying my expression. "Different how?" I struggled to put the feeling into words. It wasn't anything specific I could point to. No obvious signs of danger or reasons for concern. Just a growing sense that something about this place felt wrong. The silence was part of it, but there was more. An atmosphere of watchfulness, as if the forest itself was paying too much attention to our presence. "Maybe I'm just tired from the hike," I said, not wanting to spread unnecessary anxiety. "Long day, tougher trail than expected." But even as I said it, I caught Eric casting another glance toward the trees surrounding our campsite. His usual easygoing demeanor seemed slightly strained, and I noticed he was staying closer to the center of the clearing than his normal camping routine would suggest. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared behind the mountain ridges. I pulled on my fleece jacket and started assembling our dinner preparations, grateful for the familiar routine of camp cooking. Boiling water, measuring out freeze-dried meal portions, checking our food supplies. These simple tasks helped ground me in the practical realities of backcountry camping. Stephanie joined me at the makeshift kitchen, organizing ingredients with her characteristic attention to detail. "Should we build a fire tonight?" she asked, looking toward the wood she'd gathered. I considered the question while lighting our camp stove. Normally, a campfire would be the natural centerpiece of our first evening in the wilderness, a source of warmth, light, and the kind of cozy atmosphere that made camping trips memorable. Tonight, though, the idea of creating a bright beacon in this eerily quiet forest didn't appeal to me. "Maybe we skip it," I said. "The stove's plenty for cooking, and honestly, I'm pretty beat from the hike." She nodded, but I caught her looking toward the dark tree line with the same uneasy expression I'd been fighting all evening. The silence pressed in around us like a physical presence, broken only by the quiet hiss of our camp stove and the occasional whisper of wind through the massive trees surrounding our clearing. Eric finished with his tent setup and joined us for dinner preparation, but his usual stream of camping stories and light-hearted observations was notably absent. Instead, he kept glancing over his shoulder toward the forest, as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows between the trees. "Quite a workout getting up here," he said, attempting his normal conversational tone. Trail conditions were definitely more challenging than the guidebook suggested. His voice sounded slightly forced, as if he was working harder than usual to maintain a sense of normalcy. I appreciated the effort, but it only highlighted how unnatural the atmosphere felt. We were three experienced campers who'd spent dozens of nights in wilderness settings, yet all of us seemed on edge for reasons none of us could clearly articulate. The freeze-dried beef stroganoff actually tasted decent, but we ate quickly and without much conversation. Each of us seemed focused on finishing our meal and retreating to the relative security of our tents. The normal camping routine of lingering around the dinner area, sharing stories, and enjoying the peaceful evening held no appeal in this strangely oppressive environment. I cleaned our cooking gear with more efficiency than enjoyment, eager to complete the necessary tasks and zip myself into my sleeping bag. The darkness beyond our small circle of headlamp light felt heavier than usual, as if it contained more than just the absence of daylight. "Early night tonight?" Stephanie suggested, echoing what all of us were thinking. "Sounds good to me," Eric replied. "Long day tomorrow if we want to explore some of the higher trails." But I could tell from his tone that exploration was the last thing on his mind. Like me, he seemed focused on getting through the night and reassessing our situation in the morning light. The enthusiasm we'd all felt during the drive up and initial hike had been replaced by a shared sense of uneasiness that none of us wanted to acknowledge directly. We finished cleaning up camp and secured our food in bear canisters with unusual haste. Normally, these end-of-day routines moved at a relaxed pace, but tonight we all seemed motivated by an unspoken desire to get into our tents as quickly as possible. "See you guys in the morning," I said, forcing a casual tone as I unzipped my tent door. "Sleep well," Stephanie replied, though her voice carried the same forced normalcy that had been creeping into all our interactions since arriving at the campsite. I crawled into my tent and zipped the door shut behind me, immediately feeling more secure despite the thin nylon walls providing no real protection from anything. The familiar ritual of arranging my sleeping bag and organizing my gear helped calm my nerves somewhat. But I couldn't shake the persistent feeling that something about this place was fundamentally wrong. Outside, I could hear Eric and Stephanie completing their own nighttime preparations, moving quietly but efficiently through their established routines. Within minutes, the clearing fell silent, except for the barely audible murmur of the creek and the occasional creak of tree branches overhead. I lay back in my sleeping bag, staring up at the tent ceiling and trying to rationalize the uneasiness that had been building all evening. We were in a remote section of wilderness, far from any roads or other campers. The silence could easily be explained by natural factors. Maybe this particular area simply didn't support much wildlife, or perhaps our presence had temporarily scared off the local animals. But even as I worked through these logical explanations, the feeling of being watched persisted. It was as if unseen eyes were focused on our small cluster of tents from somewhere in the dark forest surrounding us, studying our movements and waiting for something I couldn't begin to imagine. Sleep refused to come. I shifted positions in my sleeping bag for what felt like the 100th time, trying to find a comfortable angle on the uneven ground beneath my tent. Every small sound seemed amplified in the oppressive quiet. The rustle of nylon against my jacket, the soft creak of tent poles adjusting to the night breeze, the barely audible trickle of water from the nearby creek. The feeling of being observed hadn't faded since we'd set up camp. If anything, it had grown stronger as darkness settled completely over the forest. I found myself holding my breath at random intervals, straining to hear something that might explain the persistent unease crawling up my spine. Nothing came except the occasional groan of tree branches overhead, massive Douglas firs swaying in wind currents I couldn't feel down here in the clearing. My watch's green glow showed 1:47 a.m. when I checked it again. Nearly 6 hours since we'd retreated to our tents, and I'd managed maybe 20 minutes of actual sleep scattered across brief, restless periods. Each time I started drifting off, some primitive part of my brain would jolt me awake with the insistent message that this place demanded vigilance. I rolled onto my back and stared up at the tent ceiling, barely visible in the absolute darkness. The silence pressed down like a physical weight, thick and unnatural in a way that made my ears ring from the strain of listening. Even city dwellers like me knew that forests were supposed to have nighttime sounds. Owls calling, small animals moving through underbrush, insects buzzing around in their nocturnal routines. This complete absence of life felt wrong on a level that bypassed rational thought and went straight to instinct. The creek should have provided some background noise, but even that seemed muted tonight. During our dinner preparations, I'd noticed how quietly the water moved over the stones, creating barely a whisper instead of the cheerful babbling you'd expect from a mountain stream. Everything about this place seemed designed to absorb sound rather than produce it. My mind wandered to the difficult hike we'd endured to reach this campsite. 3 stream crossings, overgrown trails, vegetation so thick that Eric had needed to beat it back with his trekking poles. The whole area felt abandoned, as if even the Forest Service had given up maintaining access to this particular valley. Maybe there was a reason other campers avoided this spot. A stick snapped somewhere in the distance, and I froze completely. The sound had come from deep in the trees, maybe 50 yards beyond our clearing. I waited for follow-up noises, footsteps, more breaking branches, anything that might indicate what had caused the disturbance. The silence that followed felt even more oppressive than before. My heart rate picked up as I considered the possibilities. Black bears were common in these mountains, though they usually avoided human campsites, unless attracted by improperly stored food. We'd been careful with our bear canisters, sealing everything according to the ranger's instructions. Elk or deer could explain a single branch breaking, but again, large ungulates typically didn't move around much during the middle of the night. I checked my watch again. 2:03 a.m. The numbers seemed to glow brighter in the absolute darkness, creating small spots of afterimage when I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to unzip my tent door and look outside, but a larger part insisted that staying hidden was the better choice. Whatever was out there, drawing attention to myself didn't seem wise. The sound that erupted from the forest 20 minutes later made my entire body go rigid with terror. A scream tore through the silence unlike anything I'd ever heard in my life. The sound seemed to come from somewhere deep in the trees, beyond our clearing but close enough to make the hair on my arms stand straight up. It wasn't human, I was certain of that immediately, but it also didn't match any animal call I could identify. The scream was primal and full of rage, or pain, or something even worse that my mind couldn't categorize. The sound lasted maybe 5 seconds, echoing off the mountain ridges before dying away into the oppressive quiet. My hands shook as I gripped my sleeping bag, every muscle in my body tensed for fight or flight. The scream had been powerful enough to carry for miles, yet it seemed to have originated from somewhere uncomfortably close to our campsite. Within seconds of the silence returning, I heard Eric's tent zipper being yanked open with frantic urgency. "Did you guys hear that?" His voice cracked slightly, stripped of its usual confident tone. I scrambled to find my own tent zipper, fumbling with the slider in my haste to get outside. The need to be near other people had suddenly become overwhelming, drowning out any concerns about exposing myself to whatever had made that horrible sound. "Yeah, we heard it," I called back, finally managing to get my tent door open. The clearing looked different in the darkness, shadows creating shapes that hadn't been there during our dinner preparations. Eric stood next to his tent in just his underwear and a fleece jacket, holding his headlamp but not turning it on. Smart thinking. Light would make us visible to anything watching from the trees, while ruining our night vision. Stephanie's tent zipper began moving with jerky, uneven motions. When she finally emerged, the beam of her flashlight wavered unsteadily, casting jumping shadows across the campsite. Her face looked pale even in the dim light, and I could see her hands trembling as she gripped the light. "What was that?" she whispered, moving closer to where Eric and I stood near the center of the clearing. Eric shook his head slowly, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I have no idea. I've been camping all over Washington and Oregon for 15 years, and I've never heard anything like that." Coming from Eric, that admission carried extra weight. The guy had encountered black bears, mountain lions, elk during rutting season, and every other piece of Pacific Northwest wildlife you could imagine. If something could make him sound genuinely shaken, it was serious business. We stood close together in the darkness, 3 people forming an unconscious defensive circle while we strained to hear any follow-up sounds. The silence that had settled over the forest felt even more unnatural now, as if whatever had produced that scream was waiting for our response. I found myself scanning the tree line, looking for any movement or shapes that didn't belong. The darkness between the massive trunks seemed impenetrable, creating a wall of black that could hide anything. Every shadow appeared to shift slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it, playing tricks with my peripheral vision that made my nerves jump. "Mountain lion?" Stephanie suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. Eric considered this for a moment before shaking his head. "Wrong sound. Cougars scream, but it's more of a high-pitched wail. This was..." He paused, searching for words. This sounded angry. Really angry. The 3 of us continued our silent vigil, waiting for something else to happen. Minutes passed without any additional sounds from the forest, but the oppressive atmosphere seemed to grow heavier. I kept expecting to hear movement in the underbrush, or breathing, or some indication that whatever had screamed was still nearby. My mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. We were miles from the nearest road, with only one trail leading back to civilization. Our cell phones had lost signal shortly after leaving the ranger station, cutting off any possibility of calling for help. If something dangerous was stalking our campsite, we were completely on our own. "We should pack up and get out of here," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Right now." Eric looked toward the dark trail that led back down the mountain. "In this darkness? With all those stream crossings and the overgrown sections, we'd never make it without someone getting hurt." He was right, though I hated to admit it. The trail had been challenging enough during daylight, requiring careful navigation around fallen logs and slippery creek crossings. Attempting it in complete darkness with only headlamps for illumination would be asking for a broken ankle or worse. "So, we just stay here and wait for that thing to come back?" Stephanie asked, still gripping her flashlight with white knuckles. The question hung in the air between us. None of the options felt particularly appealing, but Eric's assessment of the trail dangers was accurate. I'd seen too many hiking accidents caused by people trying to move too fast over difficult terrain, especially at night when depth perception became unreliable. "We wait until dawn," Eric said finally. "First hint of light, we pack up fast and get out of here." I nodded reluctantly, though the idea of spending another 4 hours in this place made my stomach clench. Stephanie moved even closer to our small group, creating a tight cluster of human warmth in the vast darkness surrounding us. "Nobody's going back to their tents," I said. "We stick together until morning." Neither Eric nor Stephanie argued with this plan. The thought of separating again, of returning to the isolation of individual tents, felt impossible after what we'd just experienced. Whatever had produced that horrifying scream was still out there somewhere in the forest, and the primal part of my brain insisted that our only chance of survival lay in staying close to other people. We settled into what promised to be the longest 4 hours of our lives. 3 friends huddled together in a remote clearing, waiting for dawn and counting the minutes until we could escape this cursed valley. 20 minutes passed in tense silence before I heard the first whisper drifting from somewhere deep in the trees. So faint at first that I almost convinced myself it was just wind moving through branches, but the sound had a quality that made my skin crawl. Something about the rhythm felt too deliberate, too structured to be natural. I tilted my head, straining to make sense of what I was hearing. Eric and Stephanie stood close enough that I could feel their body heat, both of them breathing quietly through their mouths in the oppressive darkness. The whisper came again, slightly louder this time, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was calling my name, not just any voice saying David, but my own voice. The exact intonation I used when trying to get someone's attention, the same pitch and rhythm I'd heard in countless recordings of myself over the years. My brain struggled to process what my ears were telling me, cycling through rational explanations that all crumbled under the weight of what I was actually experiencing. Eric. The voice came from my left, somewhere beyond the tree line where darkness swallowed everything. Eric, can you hear me? That was my voice calling to Eric. Not similar to my voice, not an approximation, my actual voice, complete with the slight hoarseness I'd developed from breathing dry mountain air all day. I felt Eric's hand grip my arm with desperate strength, his fingers digging into my fleece jacket. You hear it too, he whispered, so quietly I could barely make out the words. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The whispers were growing clearer now, more distinct, as if whatever was producing them was gaining confidence or moving closer to our campsite. Multiple voices began calling from different directions, creating a circle of sound around our clearing. Stephanie, where are you? My voice again, this time from somewhere behind Eric's tent. I can't find the trail. I need help. Stephanie made a small choking sound next to me, her flashlight beam wobbling as her hands shook. She'd been gripping that light since emerging from her tent, knuckles white with the effort of holding on to something solid and real. That's impossible, she breathed. That's your voice, but you're right here. The fake version of me continued calling to her from the darkness, the tone becoming more urgent and pleading. Stephanie, please. I think I'm lost. I can hear the creek, but I can't find my way back to camp. I wanted to shout that I was here, that whatever was out there wasn't me, but some primitive instinct warned against making any sound at all. Drawing attention to ourselves felt like the worst possible choice. Instead, I pressed closer to Eric and Stephanie, forming an even tighter cluster in the center of the clearing. More voices joined the chorus. Eric's voice began calling from somewhere near the creek, asking for help with what sounded like genuine panic. Stephanie's voice emerged from multiple locations simultaneously, creating an impossible chorus of her own speech patterns and inflections calling out from the surrounding forest. David? Eric, can you hear me? Stephanie's voice, but not coming from the woman standing right next to me. Something's wrong. I'm scared. Please help me. The real Stephanie started crying, quiet sobs that she tried to muffle with her free hand. Hearing your own voice begging for help while you stood paralyzed with terror was apparently more than anyone could handle with composure. I reached over and put my arm around her shoulders, pulling her closer to our small defensive formation. The voices became more sophisticated as they continued, incorporating details that only we would know. My doppelganger voice mentioned specific gear we'd packed, complained about the stream crossings we'd endured earlier, even referenced conversations we'd had during the hike up. The fake Eric discussed trail conditions and navigation concerns with the same expertise the real Eric possessed. Most disturbing was when my own voice began calling to Eric from somewhere beyond the creek, describing an injury in vivid detail. Eric, I fell off one of those log crossings. I think my ankle's broken. I can't walk. You have to come help me get back to camp. The voice sounded exactly like me in genuine distress, complete with the slight breathlessness that would come from shock and pain. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to respond, to call out that I was safe in the clearing, but Eric's grip on my arm tightened even further. Don't, he whispered urgently. Don't say anything. The fake version of me grew more desperate, adding details that made the scenario increasingly believable. The water's really cold and I'm getting wet. I can't feel my foot anymore. Please, Eric, I can hear you guys talking. Why won't you answer me? My chest tightened with the effort of remaining silent while listening to myself beg for help. The voice was so convincing that I found myself questioning whether I might actually be injured somewhere, whether this version of events standing in the clearing was somehow the false one. The logical part of my brain knew better, but the emotional impact of hearing yourself in distress was overwhelming. Eric's breathing became more labored as the fake voices continued their psychological assault. When Stephanie's voice began sobbing from somewhere near his tent, describing being chased by something through the underbrush, I felt his whole body tense like a coiled spring. "Stephanie, I can't run anymore," her own voice cried from the darkness. "It's getting closer. Please come find me. I'm by the big fallen log where we crossed the second stream." The real Stephanie's crying intensified, and I felt her entire frame shaking against my side. The tactical precision of this torment was what made it so terrifying. Whatever was out there knew exactly how to target our protective instincts, using our own voices and personalities against us with surgical accuracy. I had to physically grab Eric's jacket when the fake Stephanie voice became truly desperate, screaming my name with such realistic terror that every fiber of my being demanded I charge into the forest to help her. "David, it's behind me. It's right behind me. I can see your headlamp. Why aren't you coming? David, please." Eric took a step toward the sound before I managed to hold him back, both of us wrestling with the overwhelming urge to respond to what sounded like our friend in mortal danger. The emotional manipulation was so effective that our rational minds couldn't fully override the impulse to provide help. "That's not her," I whispered directly into Eric's ear, repeating the words like a mantra. "Stephanie's right here. That's not her." But even as I said it, doubt crept in around the edges of my certainty. The voice was perfect. Not just the sound, but the speech patterns, the way she pronounced certain words, the inflection she used when truly frightened. If I hadn't been able to feel the real Stephanie trembling next to me, I would have been completely convinced. The three of us pressed together so tightly we could barely breathe, covering our ears with our hands in a futile attempt to block out the increasingly frantic calls. But the voices seemed to penetrate anyway, reaching us through bone conduction or some other method that made physical barriers meaningless. The fake voices began overlapping, creating a cacophony of our own speech calling from every direction simultaneously. My voice, Eric's voice, and Stephanie's voice all crying for help, describing injuries and pursuits and desperate situations that demanded immediate response. The psychological pressure was unbearable, like being attacked by weaponized versions of our own identities. Hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. The voices would fade occasionally, giving us brief moments of the oppressive silence that now seemed preferable to the alternative, before returning with renewed intensity and creativity. They began incorporating new scenarios, getting lost on the way back to the trailhead, encountering dangerous wildlife, falling into hidden ravines that required rescue operations. Each new story was perfectly crafted to exploit our friendship and mutual concern. The fake versions of ourselves displayed intimate knowledge of our personalities, our fears, our relationship dynamics. They knew exactly which buttons to push to create maximum emotional distress, while we stood helpless to respond. My watch showed 4:17 a.m. when I checked it during one of the brief quiet periods. We'd been enduring this psychological torture for nearly 2 hours, and dawn was still more than an hour away. My nerves felt completely raw. Every muscle in my body ached from tension, and my mind kept questioning what was real and what wasn't. The voices began to fade as the first hint of gray appeared through the canopy overhead. Not all at once, but gradually, like a radio signal growing weaker as the broadcaster moved farther away. The fake calls became more distant and distorted before finally dissolving entirely into the morning stillness. dawn light filtered through the massive Douglas firs with agonizing slowness, revealing our campsite exactly as we'd left it the evening before. Our tents stood undisturbed. Our gear remained properly secured. The creek continued its quiet flow along the edge of the clearing. Everything looked completely normal, as if nothing unusual had happened during the night. But the three of us remained huddled together in the center of the clearing, exhausted and traumatized by hours of psychological warfare that had left no physical evidence of its occurrence. The silence that had once felt oppressive now seemed like a blessing compared to the alternative we'd just endured. The first pale hint of daylight creeping through the canopy felt like salvation. None of us had moved from our tight cluster in the center of the clearing since the voices had finally stopped. But that gray glow filtering down through the massive Douglas firs triggered something primal in all three of us. Without a word, we broke apart and rushed toward our tents with frantic energy. I didn't bother with my usual methodical packing routine. Sleeping bag got stuffed into its compression sack without rolling. Clothes got crammed into whatever space I could find. Gear got thrown into my pack in complete disarray. Everything that had taken careful organization the night before now happened in desperate haste, driven by the overwhelming need to get away from this cursed clearing as fast as possible. Eric was doing the same thing at his tent, jamming equipment into his pack with none of his typical outdoor precision. Tent stakes got yanked from the ground and tossed loose into his bag, guy lines wrapped haphazardly around anything convenient. Stephanie moved between her tent and our cooking area like she was fleeing a house fire, grabbing items and shoving them into whatever container would hold them. The silence that had once felt oppressive now seemed fragile, like it might shatter at any moment and release those horrible voices back into the morning air. Every small noise we made, zippers closing, gear clanking together, boots scuffing against dirt, sounded absurdly loud in the stillness. I kept expecting to hear my own voice calling from the trees, asking why we were leaving so early. My hands shook as I rolled up my tent, making the process take twice as long as usual. The lightweight fabric seemed determined to fight me, billowing and twisting as I tried to stuff it into its carrying bag. Sweat beaded on my forehead from the effort and adrenaline, mixing with the cold morning air to create an uncomfortable, clammy feeling across my skin. We finished breaking camp in maybe 15 minutes, a process that should have taken us at least 45 with proper care. None of us bothered with final sweeps of the area or double-checking that we'd packed everything correctly. The urgent need to leave overrode every other consideration, including basic wilderness ethics about leaving no trace. I shouldered my pack and immediately felt the unbalanced weight distribution from my hasty packing job. Gear shifted awkwardly with each movement, creating uncomfortable pressure points and threatening to throw off my center of gravity. Under normal circumstances, I would have stopped to repack everything properly, but the thought of spending another minute in this clearing was unbearable. Eric and Stephanie finished their own frantic preparations at roughly the same time, both looking as disheveled and desperate as I felt. Eric's usually meticulous attention to gear organization had completely disappeared, leaving his pack bulging at odd angles with improperly secured equipment. Stephanie's face was streaked with dried tears, and she kept glancing toward the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Without discussing it, I took the lead position as we approached the trail back toward the parking area. Eric had been our navigator and pace setter throughout the trip, but something in me needed to be the one setting our escape route. Maybe it was residual adrenaline from the night's terror, or maybe I just couldn't handle following someone else when every instinct screamed at me to run. The trail looked different in the gray dawn light, somehow more threatening than it had during our afternoon arrival. Shadows stretched between the massive tree trunks in ways that created optical illusions, making fallen logs look like crouching figures, and normal undergrowth appear to shift when viewed peripherally. I forced myself to focus on the path directly in front of my boots, avoiding the temptation to scan the forest for movement. I set a pace that was probably too aggressive for the difficult terrain, but none of us complained. My legs felt shaky from exhaustion and nervous energy, but the alternative of moving slowly through this forest was unacceptable. Behind me, I could hear Eric and Stephanie breathing hard as they struggled to match my speed, their own packs creating similar gear-shifting sounds with each hurried step. The first stream crossing approached after maybe 20 minutes of hard hiking. The log bridge that had concerned Eric yesterday now looked completely treacherous in the dim light, slick with morning dew and sagging under its own weight. I tested it carefully with my hiking pole before committing my full weight, feeling the wood flex ominously beneath my boots. Eric waited until I was completely across before starting his own crossing, moving with quick, nervous steps that made the log bounce more than was probably safe. Stephanie followed immediately after, practically running across the makeshift bridge rather than taking careful, measured steps. All of us seemed to understand that lingering anywhere was dangerous, even at obvious hazard points like stream crossings. We'd been hiking for about 30 minutes when I heard Eric's voice calling from somewhere off to the left of the trail. "David, wait up. I fell off the log back there. I think my leg's broken." The voice came from maybe 50 yards away, beyond a thick stand of devil's club and salmonberry bushes that blocked my view of the source. It sounded exactly like Eric, in genuine distress, with the same slight rasp he got when breathing hard during difficult climbs. The tone carried real pain and confusion, the kind of vulnerability that demanded immediate response from anyone who cared about him. I stopped walking and turned around to look at the real Eric, who was following directly behind me on the trail with an expression of absolute terror on his face. His mouth was hanging open slightly, eyes wide with the shock of hearing his own voice coming from the wrong location. The fake Eric continued calling from the bushes, adding details that made the scenario increasingly believable. "I can see your headlamps through the trees. Why aren't you coming? The water's really cold down here and I can't feel my foot." The real Eric moved closer to me, close enough that I could see him trembling. His face had gone pale beneath the dirt and sweat from our hasty descent, and he kept looking toward the source of his own voice with the expression of someone watching their worst nightmare come to life. "That's not me," he whispered, though the statement was obviously unnecessary. "That's not me, but it knows about the log bridge. It knows I was worried about crossing it yesterday." I nodded and grabbed his arm, pulling him forward along the trail. Whatever was out there had apparently followed us down from the clearing, tracking our movement and waiting for the right moment to resume its psychological warfare. The fact that it knew specific details about our hike suggested we were dealing with something that had been watching us far longer than just the previous night. We'd barely started moving again when Stephanie's voice began crying from somewhere deeper in the forest, off to our right this time. "David, Eric, can you hear me? Something's chasing me through the woods. I ran off the trail trying to get away from it and now I'm lost." The fake Stephanie sounded absolutely terrified, with the kind of breathless panic that came from genuine pursuit. Her voice cracked with exhaustion and fear as she continued calling for help, describing her location relative to landmarks we'd passed during our ascent the day before. "I'm by that big fallen cedar we had to climb over yesterday, the one with all the moss growing on top. Please come find me. I can hear it moving through the bushes behind me." I turned to check on the real Stephanie, who was following about 10 feet behind Eric with tears streaming down her face again. Hearing her own voice beg for rescue while she stood helpless on the trail was clearly more than she could handle with any kind of composure. She'd covered her ears with her hands, but the fake calls seemed to penetrate anyway. Every protective instinct I possessed screamed at me to charge into the forest and find whoever was calling for help. The voice was so convincing, so perfectly accurate in its reproduction of Stephanie's speech patterns and emotional responses, that my body kept trying to respond before my brain could override the impulse. I had to physically force myself to keep walking down the trail instead of turning toward the sound. "It's getting closer," the fake Stephanie sobbed from the trees. "I can see something moving between the branches. Why won't you answer me? I know you can hear me calling." The real Stephanie made a choking sound behind me, and I heard Eric speaking to her in urgent, quiet tones. I couldn't make out his words over the sounds of our movement and the continued calls from the forest, but his voice carried the same kind of desperate reassurance I'd use if trying to keep someone calm during a crisis. Eric jogged up beside me, matching my aggressive pace while glancing nervously between the trail ahead and the forest around us. "It's tracking us," he said, breathing hard from the combination of exertion and fear. "The voices are moving parallel to the trail, keeping up with our speed. Whatever's out there knows exactly where we are." I increased our pace even more, pushing the limits of what was safe on the rough terrain. My pack bounced uncomfortably with each step, poorly distributed weight, throwing off my balance on uneven sections of trail. Behind us, I could hear Stephanie struggling to keep up, her breathing becoming more labored as we practically jogged down the mountain. The fake voices became more desperate and angry when their calls continued to go unanswered. My own voice began shouting from multiple locations simultaneously, creating an impossible chorus of myself demanding to know why Eric and Stephanie weren't coming to help. The fake Eric grew increasingly frantic, claiming his injury was getting worse and that he was losing consciousness from blood loss. But it was the fake Stephanie voice that pushed us from fast hiking into an actual run. The crying shifted to screaming, describing pursuit by something that was gaining ground quickly. The voice painted a vivid picture of being chased through the underbrush by an entity that moved wrong, that didn't respect the physical laws governing normal animals. "It's right behind me now," she screamed, from somewhere uncomfortably close to our position. "I can see it through the trees. It's not human. Oh God, it's not human at all." The fake screaming dissolved into sounds that no human throat could produce, harsh, guttural noises that seemed to come from multiple sources at once, creating an acoustic pattern that made my inner ear feel like it was being attacked. The sounds grew louder and more aggressive, shifting from attempts at mimicry to pure intimidation. We ran down that mountain trail like our lives depended on it, crashing through undergrowth and leaping over fallen logs with complete disregard for safety. My pack threatened to pull me backward on steep sections, gear rattling and shifting with each impact. Branches whipped across my face and arms, leaving scratches that I barely noticed through the adrenaline rush. The inhuman sounds followed us down the trail, sometimes seeming to come from directly overhead in the canopy, other times echoing from ravines we couldn't see. Whatever was producing them had abandoned any pretense of being human, letting us hear its true nature as it pursued our retreat. Eric stumbled once on a loose rock and nearly went down, but managed to catch himself with his trekking poles and keep moving. Stephanie was breathing so hard I worried she might hyperventilate, but she maintained our desperate pace without complaint. All three of us understood that stopping for any reason could be fatal. The sounds grew more distant as we continued our frantic descent, suggesting that whatever was chasing us had limitations we didn't understand. Maybe it was tied to the clearing where we'd camped, or maybe it simply couldn't match our speed on the rough trail. Either way, the growing silence felt like a reprieve that none of us trusted to last. We kept running until my legs felt like rubber, and my lungs burned with each breath, driven by terror that overrode physical limitations. The trail blurred past in a continuous stream of obstacles to navigate and hazards to avoid, each stream crossing and fallen log, becoming another barrier between us and the horror we'd left behind in the valley. My legs gave out the moment I saw the weathered wooden trailhead sign through the trees ahead. One second, I was stumbling forward on pure adrenaline, and the next I was face down in the dirt and gravel of the small parking area, my body refusing to take another step. The sudden transition from desperate running to complete collapse hit me like a wall. I rolled onto my back, gasping for air that felt thin and insufficient no matter how deeply I breathed. My pack had twisted awkwardly during the fall, digging into my ribs and shoulders in ways that should have hurt more than they did. Everything felt distant and muffled, like I was experiencing the world through thick glass. Eric and Stephanie appeared in my field of vision, both of them looking as exhausted and wild-eyed as I felt. Stephanie's face was streaked with dirt and sweat, her hair matted against her forehead from our frantic descent. Eric's usual outdoor composure had completely cracked, leaving him looking older and more fragile than I'd ever seen him. They grabbed my arms and hauled me upright, supporting most of my weight as we stumbled toward the truck. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, rubber and unreliable beneath me. The short walk to our vehicle took forever, each step requiring conscious effort to coordinate movement that should have been automatic. Eric fumbled with his keys for what felt like minutes before managing to unlock the doors. We collapsed into our seats with the graceless desperation of people who had pushed their bodies beyond reasonable limits. I slumped against the passenger door, feeling the cool glass against my cheek as I tried to convince my nervous system that we were safe now. The truck sat silent except for our labored breathing and the occasional creak of settling gear in the back. Eric gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, staring straight ahead at the Forest Service road that would take us away from this place. Stephanie curled up in the back seat, hugging her knees to her chest like she was trying to make herself as small as possible. Nobody spoke for several minutes. What was there to say? We'd all experienced the same impossible horror, heard our own voices calling from the darkness, felt the presence of something that shouldn't exist hunting us through the forest. Any attempt to rationalize or explain what had happened felt premature when we were still processing the basic fact of survival. Eric finally turned the key in the ignition, and the engine's familiar rumble felt like the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. He backed out of the parking space with jerky, unpracticed movements, clearly as shaken as the rest of us. The truck lurched forward onto the rough Forest Service road, carrying us away from the trailhead at a speed that probably wasn't safe for the terrain. I watched the trees blur past my window, noting how normal they looked in the growing daylight. Just Douglas firs and undergrowth, the kind of forest I'd hiked through dozens of times without incident. Nothing about the landscape suggested the nightmare we'd endured, which somehow made the experience feel even more surreal and disturbing. The drive down from the mountains passed in a haze of exhaustion and nervous tension. Eric navigated the increasingly smooth roads with mechanical precision, but I could see his hands trembling on the steering wheel. We stopped once for gas at a station near Olympia, and even that brief pause outside the truck felt dangerous and exposed. Back on the highway, Stephanie finally broke the silence. "We can't tell anyone about this." Eric nodded without taking his eyes off the road. "They'd think we were crazy." "Hell, I'm not sure I don't think we're crazy." I understood what they meant, but some part of me already knew I wouldn't be able to let this go without answers. The experience had been too vivid, too precisely targeted to dismiss as mass hallucination or collective panic. Something had been out there in those woods, something that knew us intimately enough to weaponize our own voices against us. The 3-hour drive back to Seattle felt endless, each mile marker counting down our distance from the mountains with agonizing slowness. Traffic thickened as we approached the city, surrounding us with the comforting normalcy of commuters and delivery trucks. The urban environment felt like armor against whatever we'd left behind in the wilderness. Eric dropped me off at my apartment building just after noon, the truck pulling away before I'd even reached the front door. None of us had discussed meeting up later or processing what we'd been through together. We needed time alone to convince ourselves that we were actually safe. My apartment felt strange and unfamiliar after 3 days of planning for the camping trip. The comfortable furniture and familiar belongings seemed to belong to a different person, someone who hadn't heard his own voice calling from the darkness or run down a mountain trail in absolute terror. I showered off the dirt and sweat from our escape, letting the hot water run longer than was probably responsible. But I couldn't shake the need to understand what had happened to us. As the afternoon wore on, that need grew into an obsession that overrode my exhaustion. I fired up my laptop and started searching for anything related to the area where we'd camped, beginning with basic geographic information before moving into more esoteric territory. The official Forest Service websites contained standard warnings about bear safety and trail conditions, nothing that suggested the kind of supernatural encounter we'd experienced. But when I started digging into historical records and anthropological studies, a different picture began to emerge. The Quinault and Skokomish tribes had traditional stories about that specific valley, legends passed down through generations about entities they called the voice stealers, or echo spirits. According to these accounts, malevolent beings inhabited certain remote areas of the forest, creatures that could perfectly mimic human speech to lure travelers deeper into the wilderness where they would vanish without a trace. The stories were remarkably consistent across different tribal sources, describing entities that studied their victims for days or weeks before using their acquired knowledge to create perfect vocal replicas. The spirits supposedly fed on human fear and confusion, growing stronger with each successful hunt until they became powerful enough to manifest physical presence beyond simple voice mimicry. I found academic papers that discussed these legends in the context of cautionary tales designed to keep people away from dangerous terrain. But the researchers had clearly never experienced anything like what we'd been through. Their clinical analysis completely missed the visceral truth of what those stories were describing. More disturbing were the modern accounts I discovered on hiking forums and paranormal websites. Scattered reports from the past 30 years described nearly identical experiences in the same general area where we'd camped. Campers hearing their own voices calling from the forest, groups being psychologically tormented by perfect vocal mimicry, desperate escapes down mountain trails in the early morning hours. Most of these accounts were buried in comment threads or dismissed by other users as imagination, wildlife sounds, or deliberate hoaxes. But the details were too specific and consistent to be coincidental. People were describing the exact same phenomenon we'd experienced, down to the tactical precision of the psychological warfare and the way the fake voices incorporated intimate knowledge of their victims. I printed out everything I could find: tribal legends, academic papers, forum posts, even a few newspaper articles about missing hikers in the region. The stack of documents grew throughout the afternoon as I followed one lead after another, building a comprehensive file of evidence that what we'd encountered was neither unique nor unknown. By evening, I had enough material to fill a small binder. I called Eric and Stephanie, asking them to come over without explaining why over the phone. They arrived within an hour, both looking as hollow and exhausted as I felt. The shared trauma had created a bond between us that didn't require words or explanation. I spread the printed documents across my kitchen table, watching their faces as they read through the accounts of other people who had experienced identical horrors. The relief in their expressions was profound. Not the relief of being vindicated, but the deeper comfort of knowing we weren't losing our minds. The Quinault called them echo spirits, I said, pointing to one of the anthropological papers. Entities that steal voices and use them to hunt humans. The stories go back hundreds of years. Eric picked up a forum post from 2018, scanning the detailed account of a family that had fled their campsite after hearing their children's voices calling from the forest while the kids slept safely in their tent. "This happened in the same valley where we camped," he said quietly. "Same creek, same general area. The poster even mentions that weird silence we noticed." Stephanie was reading a tribal legend about a young hunter who followed his own voice deeper and deeper into the mountains until his family never saw him again. Her hands shook slightly as she turned the pages, processing the implications of what we'd learned. "So this thing has been hunting people for centuries," she said, "and we just walked right into its territory like we were delivering ourselves for dinner." The research confirmed our worst fears, while simultaneously providing a framework for understanding what we'd survived. We weren't the first people to encounter these entities, and we probably wouldn't be the last. But unlike many of the historical accounts, we'd been smart enough or lucky enough to resist the lure of the fake voices and escape before something worse could happen. We spent hours going through the documents together, cross-referencing details and building a more complete picture of what existed in those mountains. The pattern was clear. The entities were territorial, patient, and extremely dangerous to anyone who ventured into their domain, unprepared for psychological warfare. As the evening progressed, we made a collective decision that felt both obvious and profound. None of us would ever return to that section of the Olympic National Forest. The mountains held plenty of other areas for camping and backpacking, places that didn't harbor ancient predators with the ability to turn our own voices against us. I remained passionate about outdoor adventures and wilderness exploration, but my relationship with the forest had been fundamentally altered by our experience. The knowledge that such entities existed out there, waiting in remote valleys for unwary campers, would influence every future trip I planned. Some areas were simply too dangerous to explore, regardless of how beautiful or challenging they might be. The research provided closure of a sort, confirming that what we'd experienced was real and documented, even if most people chose to dismiss such accounts as folklore or imagination. We'd encountered something that existed at the intersection of indigenous wisdom and modern horror, something that science couldn't explain, but couldn't entirely ignore either. Looking at the stack of printed documents spread across my table, I felt grateful for the curiosity that had driven me to seek answers. Without this research, we might have spent years questioning our own sanity or trying to rationalize away an experience that defied rational explanation. Instead, we now understood exactly what we'd survived and why we'd been so fortunate to escape with our lives.